All right, welcome to my channel. I have a very special guest, Helen Walters, today, who is a poet, jewelry maker, and potter who has published two books, Poems from the High Prairie, which this is a poetry book from the poetry group that meets up in Roswell, the High Prairie Poet Society. She has seven poems in here. She has also just published a new book, Dead Friends in New Mexico, Missing Them. It was published on Amazon in December. Yay, she's showing.
I I didn't get a copy yet, but I printed this so you could see.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
She is going to start her own poetry group in Roswell soon that will also include short fiction or just short story writers, correct?
Mhm. Yes,
And
Paul. It's going to
huh?
be poets and writers. Paul.
What's it? I love that. The High Prairie Society gets together once a month to read their poems at Stellar Coffee. Your new book, you did 21 poems in 21 days.
Right.
So, was it difficult to write a poem a day?
It was challenging. It was very challenging. It was a challenge by Bookleaf Publishing to write 21 poems in 21 days. And they actually tell you you don't have to write them. You can pull them out of your files and add them. But a lot of them I had written, handwritten copies and just notes. And it kind of urged me to continue finishing those poems that I had about people that I knew.
That's
So,
awesome.
yeah.
What inspired you to become a lifelong poet?
You know, I've given that one a lot of thought. And as I was cleaning up and moving some of my things around, I was like, oh, yeah, my God, fourth grade. I totally remember a new girl came into our class. She had moved from the Carolinas and it was winter. She fell and broke her hip. And I was her neighbor. So they asked, could I deliver her homework and pick it up and bring it back? It was the first time they used an intercom in the school to have her attend class through the intercom. And I wrote a poem called Fragile Doll about her being very fragile and coming into a new place and having this happen to her. And I mean, I was able to give it to her, and she actually read it to the class because she was very impressed. And I thought, wow, I made somebody's day. I documented what I knew about them and getting through her struggle. And I kept going. I kept kind of like finding things to write about. And in sixth grade, I actually wrote a poem that my mother's friend was like, this is wonderful. This should be published. And I was like, wow, somebody actually appreciates what I'm writing, and that was called Fishy Fishy. I still want to get it illustrated and put it out as a children's book.
That sounds
Um,
awesome.
yeah. So, and I've read it to my grandsons and it got them interested in poetry. Of course, all the children's books were, Hop on Pop and, lots of things rhymed. And I had the Scholastic Book Club. They gave us flyers every month. And I saved my lunch money so I could purchase books. And one of them was The Child's Garden of Verses. And then my mother gave me this book. She had this for a long time, The Best Loved Poems of the American People. And you can see all the bookmarks and dog tags in here. I mean, I
Can
have
you
read this.
raise it up a little bit more? There we go.
There's the title. It's on
Wow.
the side.
There you go.
I was reading poetry at a very young age and finding it was a way to kind of wrap up my emotions and put down into writing things that I couldn't say, I couldn't speak about. And sometimes I'd see a movie and it would inspire me to write something. Like I wrote one about a person in war being shot and dying and praying for the other person. And somebody says, why did you write this? I said, well, that movie really touched me. I said, nothing in this is about me personally, but this is how I imagined, this person in the movie feeling. They were like, don't ever show that to anybody. They're going to think it's about you. And I'm like, yeah, all the poetry I write is not about me. A lot of people, that's the only expression, and they never let people read it. But I went on, I started writing poetry for our Holland Happenings, which was our school newsletter. In high school, I went on to join the literary club and creative writing and got published in their literary magazine. And then in college, I became an editor of our poetry literary magazine. And I did research on the poems and the poets, and I did a 21-year look back over the history of the magazine to see, find the poetry that had already been published. So I actually have a couple copies of the poems from that. And this one, I actually designed the cover.
Oh, that's so cool. That's beautiful.
And a lot of the illustrations, I contributed to that as well. But then it stopped. You go on, you get married, life goes on. But I journaled a lot of my time, and I would go back through my journals and say, "Hey, this couple lines would be a great poem." So I would use that for my inspiration. And then I met my husband, my second husband, and we started collaborating on poetry together. We were going through divorces and dealing with custody issues. And one of the poems that we collaborated on was Robbers of the Worst Kind, Stealing Precious Moments Never to Be Mine. And, it was really heart-wrenching what we were going through. And this was the way we expressed ourselves. But then again, life went on, and I got involved in other things and did arts things and ran nonprofits and, met lots and lots of people throughout this, my career as in graphic arts, as an activity director, even doing bookkeeping in Taos, which was like a working vacation. And, I did a few poems there, but when I got to Roswell and I had to take care of my husband, I did a lot of creative things to keep my mind busy while I was taking care of him. And my emotions were very strong at that point, and I wrote a lot during that. Then I had a mishap with a perforated ulcer and emergency surgery, and realized, wow, I am alive. I want to show something for it. And I wrote a poem about my experience. I went to the open mic night at Stellar's, and there was 6 women reciting poetry that they had written about their medical conditions and getting through them. So I know there's other poets out there. And I found the High Prairie Poets Society and started going to that. And we were meeting at Stellar's. Now they're at Grace Community Church. So I said, I want to start another couple groups of poetry. And I just kind of said, I can't do my artwork anymore. I can't do beading. I used to make the trees of life. I made 200 of these.
Wow.
But with my arthritis and my hand, I couldn't do it. And the pottery and ceramics became some therapy for me to keep my hands moving. Then we lost the art museum, and I did lapidary work. The Roswell Adult Center's gone. I said, I have to keep going. I have to keep going. I can't let that stop me. So I said, well, if I can't do that, I'm just going to concentrate on poetry, and I will become the poetry pusher of Roswell.
Yeah. Has your new group started yet? And when will they meet and where?
Yes, I've actually started a group over at Senior Circle, and it's, although they have an age limit, she said, you can invite anybody to this. We don't mind. I'm up to 8 poets in that group now, but we're also going to start meeting at Stellar's again on the second Saturday, because the High Prairie Poets meets the third Saturday. And the church is nice. They gave us a community room to use, but it's very sterile. And at the coffee shop, it's like there's people coming and going. They see you, they want to know what you're doing, they join in. So I've told the leader of High Prairie Poets, I'm like, no, that's still in existence. You can keep that one at the church. I'm starting a new one to get younger people involved and other people involved that might not even know where the church is or don't feel comfortable in a church setting. This is non-denominational group. It's not a religious group. It's pure poetry. But we invite people who are writing poetry, interested in reading other people's poetry. I've got people that read Tennyson and the classics. So it's like, yeah, we encourage it. In fact, for Halloween, we read Edgar Allan's Poe, The Raven, and I got poetry books. I had about 6 poetry books, found the poem in each one of them, and each person had a part to read. So it was a group reading, and everybody really enjoyed doing that. So yeah, we have started, and I'd like to invite people to come out to Stellar's on the second Saturday, and we'll meet in front unless we get too big and there's a back room we can move back there.
What
Um,
time do you meet?
we're going to be meeting about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the time that High Prairie also meets. At Senior Circle, we're meeting at 1 o'clock on Wednesdays. And it was every other Wednesday, but a couple of members of the group said, could we meet every week? I was like, okay, I'll show up every week, and whoever shows up, I'm there for you. I also go over basics of different types of poetry, haiku, limericks, prose, even slam poetry, which there is something coming up in Albuquerque that I hope to go to. They're having a lot of workshops, and the final slam is on March 22nd. Now, I'm not going to perform,
Oh,
but
that would have been
I
cool.
want to learn about this. Now, I might go to some of the workshops where they have, performances available, but it's actually very pricey to run a poetry slam. It's $300 for a team or $150 for an individual.
Wow.
But it gets you out there, it gets exposure for you, and if you're writing messages. There's a lot of activism poetry going on at the poetry slams, and it's very powerful. And, I hope to bring something like that to Roswell at some point in the future with my groups, which it's amazing because I think the youngest person I have in the group is 45 right now. But, poetry is something for all ages. I want to let people know this is available to you. Come on out. We'll help you. We'll help you with ideas. We'll help you find your voice. One fellow came to the farmer's market where I set up every summer, and I had my books there. And he says, I love poetry, and I know I've got it in me, but I don't know how to write poetry. I said, Kevin, go home, get a nice pen, nice piece of paper, find yourself a quiet place, and just write and let it flow. He came back the next week with a poem he had written. And he said, the title is For Helen. And the first line is, Helen told me to go home and write, and so it flows. And I was like, oh my gosh. And since then, he's come to the group with other poems that he's written, in a meditative state at bottomless lakes. And I was like, this is fantastic. I'm inspiring people. One lady that doesn't come to the group, but she takes blood pressures over at Senior Circle. She said, I don't come to your group, but I want to let you know you inspired me to put together all my poems I've written over the years in school. As a nurse, my fellow nurses, I couldn't afford gifts, so I'd write them poems. I had it bound and gave it to my daughters for Christmas. I was
Oh,
like,
that's such a nice gift.
I was so touched that I was able to inspire somebody like
Yeah,
that. And yeah, it was just amazing. She's like, yeah, I don't come to your group, but I kept hearing you and I heard a lot about it, and I walked through and I see you doing this, and it inspired me to get my stuff together.
that is
And
so great.
yeah, and a few people that are in the group have written poems and published before, but through circumstances in their life, they've lost what they've written, but they want to get back to it. I was like, we'll help you. We'll help you through this. Even if you don't remember what you wrote, you've got it in you. So let's put it on paper. Let's spread it to the world. I like being an inspiration to people. I sent one of my poems that I wrote about my daughter's pig. It's called Potato Love. It's the name of the pig.
Oh,
So I sent this poem to my brother-in-law in Alaska, and he was about 86, 87 at the time. And he says, that's great. He says, next time he called me, he says, I wrote a poem in response to your poem. I'm like, wow. He goes, yeah, because I've never picked up a pen in 20 years and never wrote a poem. He was fantastic. He wrote it, he sent it to me, and it's called Sam. It's about a hog that falls in love with Potato, the pig. So when I read Potato Love, I always read Sam with it
Oh,
because they go together now. He would watch my videos. And this is one reason I perform at open mics at Stellar's and sometimes down at the Black Hawk Brewery. And I try to have people video me so I can share it with people that I know at long distance. That I wrote Christmas 2020 for family. Even though we don't keep in touch every day, you're still in my family in every way. So keep me in prayer, keep me in mind, keep thinking of me in a way that is kind. I think of you often, for you I do pray, and think of you kindly many a day. You know, I have relatives in Alaska, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, New Jersey. I even know my cousins in Canada and Poland, and they sometimes get on and see my stuff. It kind of gives me reaching out to the world and my family and letting them know, you know, I'm okay.
yeah.
And this is what I'm doing. And, you know, and I share it with them. A lot of them like have gotten back to me like, this is so cool. How can you get up in public and speak? And I'm like, well, it took a long time, but anybody can do this.
Do you have a
And
YouTube channel? How do you
I
share your
I
videos?
don't. Yeah, I should, shouldn't
You
I?
should, and then post them and
Yeah,
reach an even larger audience.
yeah. Well, I hadn't thought about that until our flood and all the destruction here. And it's like, look, I've got to do something to help everybody. I've got to, you know, lift their spirits. I try and do upbeat things. When I do the open mic at the Black Hawk Brewery, I maybe change my poems to a different type that I wouldn't do at Stellar's, which is more family oriented. Black Hawk Brewery, I can get away with some of the crazier poems, let's
Right.
say.
Right.
Um, but there's always something to write about. And I kind of, you know, I just jot down on little slips of paper like this one. I've always lost track of time trying to come up with a rhyme. And even the grandson said, Abuela, why do you talk in rhyme? I said, I talk in rhyme? Do I do it all the time? And they're like, you're doing it again. But it helped them too, because the 7-year-old, well, he's 9 now, but when he was 7, he didn't like his English class. When they hit poetry, though, he became very excited because of the poems that I had written at the house about them and, you know, reciting them with them. And even, you know, all the family was reading them to them. So he did a poem, read it in class, introduced the next person, ran back to his mom. And I heard him say, Mom, we got to find some open mics. I like this public speaking. Wow, this is very cool to
That-
see that it's being passed on in the generations.
That's
So
exciting. Usually children do not like public speaking, so that's great. I hope he never loses that.
me too. So, you know, I go back there and I encourage them. And with the book that just got published, my daughter bought a copy from Amazon. You can also get it an ebook on Bookleaf Publishing, where I originally wrote it. So she bought a copy and she's talking to me, and then I hear the young man going, hey, tell her I love her book. I was like, oh my gosh, he read it. She goes, oh, we've been reading it every night. Yeah, we reread them. And then he's like, ah, she's really good. I'm like, this is so nice to hear. You know, and the fact that he took it to his pop, my ex, and he's like, hey, I think I'll buy a copy of this book too.
Oh, wow. That's nice.
Yeah, yeah. So you know, I want
What
to
a
encourage the
what a
little one.
special gift to give your grandchildren and your family. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Who are your poetry inspirations? Who inspires you to write? I mean, I know everything inspires you, but do you
Yeah.
have any poets that you just absolutely love?
Shel Silverstein is very good. He's written lots of, you know, children's poems, and he actually wrote A Boy Called Sue, performed by Johnny Cash. And a lot of people don't realize that's a Shel Silverstein poem. So he was one. I don't know. There's so many of them. Anonymous is really good. Anonymous is one of my favorite poets, or unknown. There's a lot of poetry in the volumes that I've collected that just they're not attributed to anybody. So, I'm like, well, I could be anonymous. I'm like, no, why should I be anonymous? I got a good name.
Right.
So, yeah, anonymous has really helped me a lot.
Interesting. Wow.
um, one of my favorite ones was the Jabberwocky from Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll.
Uh-huh.
Um, and some of them are just kind of long story poems that I've read, and there's so many of those. And I think every poem tells some sort of story, which is why I've broadened this second poetry group to poets and writers, because I've also written some short stories, but I haven't ventured anywhere with them yet. But I tell people, you want to write your life story, start with little vignettes and put it in a poem, and that will get you started on the big picture. Just keep writing little snippets, and eventually they'll all come together, and you can have your autobiography. You can write a novel from it. I have written some short stories, started by a poem, and then I was like, no, this is too good. Like, one of my short stories is The Junkyard Girl, and that one's completed. And I sent it to a longtime friend. I have a friend from high school. We've known each other over 50 years,
Wow.
which is amazing. And she's been collecting poetry, and she's always also pushed me to write more poems. She's like, anytime you write a poem, I want to see it. Send it to me. I don't do social media. So write it, put it in writing, and send it to me. And she has volumes of poetry she's collected over the years. And, so we've shared that love, and that's kept our friendship going for quite a long time. So she
That's
kind of
good.
has inspired me to keep going. Um, it's just, I need to do something to keep busy, keep my mind off of, craziness in the world. And my poetry has actually become a way of venting frustrations now. So I can see another book in that. But I want to do another book with just lighthearted things that are more for children. Because I sat at my daughter's house one day. They all went out, and I'm like, wow, all right, I've got balloons, I've got Angus the dog, I've got these chickies, I've got the toys and the boys and their toys. So I wrote about 8 poems in 2 hours that day.
Wow.
Yeah, because everything had been happening all week long, and then finally I had this time to myself, and I said, oh, I got to document some of this. And it just starts flowing. And that's what it's about, is getting into the flow. But when I drive around, I have a notebook, and if I see something, I'm like, ooh, look at that oil belching out of our earth, and I write down. And between Artesia and here, I came up with another poem. You know, so it happens. It's like you got to go to the bathroom. It's got to come out. So with me, it's like, oh my God, there's a poem in here. I got to get it out. I got to put it down. I got to capture it. So yeah, I'm thinking poems a lot of the time, and I'll be somewhere and say, oh yeah, that's a good subject. Oh, look at that. I want to write about that. So I've got a cigar box filled with little notes of possibilities for poetry. And when I get in a depressed mood, it's often a time when I'll sit down and start writing. And I'll get my depression out on the paper. And then eventually I kind of come around, and I'm like, oh, okay, let me write this one. This one's going to be all totally fun. And it gets me out of the funk.
That's good. That's good.
So yeah, it's a form of therapy, but it's also a way of just expressing creativity. And it's writing it is one thing. Having it published is like a feather in my cap. Like, oh my God, I've accomplished this. People are going to now see this. I can now share this with the world. And I try and encourage my poets at the groups to find their voice so they can go out and read their poetry. We actually had our book chosen for a book club that reviews books. They only review authors from New Mexico.
Oh, wow.
The leader of the group, Ricardo, he's a teacher, and he came to my stand and found the poetry book. I explained to him it was 9 poets from Roswell that were published. It was published in Macedonia. That's another story. But he said, I'm going to take this and I want to propose that my book club review it. So they chose it one month, and he's like, could you come and do a reading? Maybe get some other poets. So we had about 5 out of the 9 poets show up for the book review club, and they read their poems. And the people there said, we loved reading them, but it's much more enjoyable to hear the poet express reading it and exactly, how it should be read and how you should, the intonations and the breaks in the poem. And they're like, it really made a difference having the poets there after all the people in the club read the book. But they were like, this brought it to life. And we read it kind of blandly, but the poet reading it always shows the emotion that went into it.
Right. It's just like listening to audiobooks. I love listening to books on audio because,
Uh-huh.
especially when the author reads it, because
Right.
it's the same thing. It just gives it more depth.
Yes.
Did
Yeah.
you want to read one of your poems to us today?
Yeah. I wrote one for the former president of the High Prairie Poet Society. He was in an auto accident with his wife, and he passed away about 8 months later. And his best friend, Tom Strama, kept the club going. He's now the president. But this is called Mr. Robert Reynolds. Robert was the group leader for many, many years. His poems would bring us insight, joy, and sometimes a few tears. He'd thank us for being here, and then he'd always say, this poetry club would not be here if we did not come out today. We'd go around the table, and each had a poem to read. Each held a piece of paper with words waiting to be freed. And as we read each poem aloud, we shared the spoken word. The audience would listen with attention to everything they heard. Sometimes we'd hear the story of what made them write this poem. It might be a life experience, a memory of childhood home. Robert was a volunteer and always a Marine. He loved to sing a solo hymn at many churches he was seen. And Robert was a man of God. He really loved the Lord. And he had a loving wife in Dawn, who Robert long adored. Tom is Robert's longtime friend, who was always by his side. Together, they did everything between them, nothing to hide. His family, Dawn, Tom, and so many people in town whose lives he touched and knew him well, are all now feeling down. What more can we say about him now he's gone? We'll remember him, how he served and loved and wrote and sang his song. So that's in the new book, too.
That's
Uh,
beautiful.
and it's just something encompassing what I knew about him. And it's like, well, he's gone, but the poetry club lives on. And we have him to thank for keeping it going. He was a president for 14 years, but the club's been around between 25 and 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and it started at the Roswell Adult Center. They would meet there, and then eventually they moved over to Stellar's. So it's kind of neat that this little town has produced so many well-written people. We're just kind of out there and nobody knows we're there. And I want to bring it to the forefront, especially with things going on in the world, to be with other published people. And, we're all kind of just regular folks, and we're all kind of laid back. And I'm just trying to help them find their voices by getting up in front of the microphone, by actually reading it. And our stellar open mic nights are pretty neat. Like sometimes it's poetry, it's musicians, it's comedy, it's storytelling. So there's a lot of interesting people that come there, and we meet them, and sometimes they get inspired by the other people reading, and they come up the next month with something they've done. So very happy to be an inspiration to people. Like I said, it's not all about me. It's about poetry in general, and helping the community find our voices.
And when is the Stellar open mic?
That is open mic night is the third Friday of the month. So if you want to do perform, you sign up about quarter to six, and 6 to 8 is when we do our thing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen, for letting me interview you today.